Now I'd like to welcome our next speaker, the author of Here Comes Everybody, a Brooklyn Town Boy Made Good, Clay Shirky.
Thank you, Brady. Brooklyn Boy Made Good. That was Biggie Smalls' bio, too. Maybe I'll ask for a different intro next time. Fairly speculative talk. It's a theme I've been thinking about for a while, and since O'Reilly's the home team, I figure I'll try it out on you and see if it makes any sense. And it starts, I can't actually see whether, yeah, there it is. It starts with this chart. You all know this chart. This is IDC's version of the chart. Hal Varian and Peter Lyman of Berkeley have a version of the chart. Google has a version of the chart. This is the chart of how fast is the amount of information in the world growing, right? And no matter who does the chart, it always looks like this. It's always up and to the right, and the rate of increase is always increasing. We love this chart, right? This chart makes us feel better. This is why I'm not getting anything done. I'm suffering from information overload, right? So this has been, right, obviously the salvation of writer-blocked tech journalists for 15 years. When you don't know what to write, you can always go down the hall to your editor and say, hey, I want to do a story about information overload. And the editor, looking up from their overflowing email inbox, says, that's brilliant. Right? And you always get to do that story. And so for 15 years, we've been reading the same story about information overload. Right? But if it's been the same story for 15 years, and you can find stories from '93 that are the same as the information overload story that showed up in your RSS feed 3 seconds ago, right? Then why is it still such a big surprise? Right? If this is the normal case, why are we consistently treating it, talking about, writing about it as if it's this big deal? And here's why I think this is. And it goes back to the printing press. Right? Gutenberg and the invention of movable type injected for the first time into life outside universities information abundance. Right? By the 1500s, the cost of producing a book had gotten so cheap, and the volume of books being produced had gotten so large that an average literate citizen could have access to more books than they could read in a lifetime. So ye olde information overload is actually a problem of fairly ancient provenance. Right? But the other problem that Gutenberg introduced into intellectual life was a problem of risk. Right? If you owned a printing press, you could make money if people bought your books, but you could lose money if people don't buy your books. Right? And since you had to print the books in advance, right, you were taking on all the risk of whether or not those books would sell. Right? Can you hear Tim backstage laughing a bitter laugh? This is the problem of publishing. Right? And so the economic solution was pretty simple. Make the publisher responsible for filtering for quality. Now, there's no obvious reason that someone who's good at running a printing press also ought to be good at figuring out what books to print. But the economic logic of print in advance, then sell at high upfront costs, and then recoup when you reach the people. Right? That economic logic meant that the word publisher has come to mean two things. Right? People who decide what to publish and people who do the publishing. There's been a lot of media revolutions between Gutenberg and now. By the middle of the 20th century, we had recorded music and movies, we had radio and television. But the curious thing is, all of those other media types had the same economics, right? Whether it's a printing press or a TV tower, it cost me a lot of money to get started. And so I had to filter for quality. So here's what the internet did. It introduced, for the first time, post-Gutenberg economics. Right? The cost of producing anything by anyone has fallen through the floor, famously. And as a result, right, there's no economic logic that says you have to filter for quality before you publish. Right? Proof of this hypothesis I leave to you. I recommend starting with LiveJournal, but you can pretty much start anywhere, right, and discover that the filter for quality is now way downstream of the site of production. So what we're dealing with now isn't information overload, because we're always dealing with information overload. Tim talked about the singularity earlier, but when you're on a chart like this, it's always the singularity. No matter where you are, the past always looks like a walk in the park, and the future always looks like a cliff face. Right? We're clocking a singularity a week at this point because of these economics. Right? And so if that's the normal case, right, then thinking about information overload isn't actually describing the problem, and thinking about filter failure is. Right? Use an example that you face, right, you will have faced, which is spam. Right? Everybody has the morning ritual. You go through, you try and take the spam out. Right? You identify the messages you have to remove, you get rid of them, and then you get on with your day. Right? And so some combination of mechanical filter plus you getting rid of the last few bits and pieces gets you along. And everyone will have had the experience over the last several years of there being a day where you say, oh my goodness, right? The volume of spam has exploded, right? This is doubled now, right? My email box is full of spam again. I had the problem managed, and now there's all this spam. And I'd noticed this happen a couple of times, and so I set out to measure it. And a few years ago, I watched my inbox, and in particular, how many messages I had to delete in the morning when I went in. And what I discovered is that my experience of spam having doubled came when the volume of spam I actually had to delete had increased by only about 25%. Right? It wasn't actually that there was a lot more information. It was that there was just enough more information to break the systems I already had in place. Right? It wasn't about the increase in volume. It was about the collapse of the filters I was using. And spam, I think, is a really good illustration of the information overload problem generally, wherever we face it. Right? It requires multiple kinds of filters. Right? There's both automated and manual. There's different kinds of solutions for different kinds of people. All the solutions are temporary. No matter what you get working, you have to retune it. Right? It's not enough to just, there is no set it and forget it solution for spam. And finally, you have to take the volume increase for granted. Right? You have to assume that you're going to continue to be targeted. The logic of spam is that the economic incentive to target you is enormously high, and the cost of doing so is enormously low. And so it really is a filtering problem rather than an information problem. And thinking about that in the context of spam, in the context of sort of traditional information management, I started to think that this is a general system design problem for our era. And when I say system design, I don't so much mean computer systems, as social systems, as the institutional bargains and the social bargains that we all have with one another when we're all dealing with each other just in our daily lives. And I'm trying to apply this idea of filter failure, of looking at filter failure as a design lens to other kinds of social systems besides just managing hard drive space and email. So let me tell you something that happened to a friend of mine last November that I think may illustrate this problem. This is a former student, now a colleague and a good friend, who last November decided to break off her engagement with her fiance. And in addition to the mix of emotional horror and administrative trivia you have to go through when you're doing something like that, she also had to engage in the 21st century ritual of the changing of the relationship status. Right? She had to go onto Facebook, and she had to grab the button that says engaged, and she had to flip it to single, and she had to press submit, and there it was. So she thinks about doing this, and then she realizes that the result of that will be that in her news feed on Facebook, suddenly, right, might as well buy a billboard. Right? And so here's her dilemma. She has a lot of friends on Facebook, but she also has a lot of friends on Facebook, people she went to high school with, people she knew peripherally 2 jobs ago. She doesn't want all of those people suddenly getting deeply personal information about her. She only wants her narrow circle of real friends to know. She especially doesn't want her fiance's friends, who have now, her recently former fiance's friends, who have now friended her, to find out from her Facebook feed. She wants to give him the space to tell them what they're doing. So she goes onto Facebook, and she says, I'm going to fix this problem. I have to do this. And so what does she find? She finds this, first of all, Facebook's privacy policy. Very clearly thought out, very clearly written, very carefully descriptive, not hidden, not buried, linked to from most pages on the site. Right? And in addition to the privacy policy, she finds this, which is the interface for managing her privacy preferences. So she figures out how she's going to do this. She goes through, she checks the appropriate checkboxes. And then, getting all of that done, she's able to do this. She's able to go to the interface, take it from engaged to single, and press the button. 2 seconds later, every single friend in her network gets this message that pops up. Your friend is now single, right? And all of her fiance's friends get that message too. And the email starts coming in, and the IM starts coming in, and the phone is ringing off the hook, and everybody knows. Total, disastrous privacy meltdown, self-inflicted, right? And we want to find fault in circumstances like this. Whose fault is this? So it's tempting to blame my friend, right? I've known her a long time. She did her graduate thesis work on a comparative analysis of Friendster, Facebook, and Meetup, right? This is not an average user. If she doesn't get the interface, it's a pretty safe bet it's out of the reach of most of the people in the Facebook audience. So then we want to blame Facebook, right? Well, they had the wrong checkboxes. They had the wrong description. They have their privacy preferences set up wrong. But it's hard to blame Facebook when they've made so much of an effort. James Grimmelman, who writes about privacy in social networks, has said that Facebook has the best expressed and best executed privacy management tools he's seen on any of the networks he's analyzed. The problem is that managing your privacy preferences is an unnatural act, right? It's just not something anybody is good at either setting up or doing. Right? Prior to the present era, the only person any of us could name who had anything that you would call privacy preferences was Greta Garbo. Right? This is not something we're used to. Privacy is a way of managing information flow. Right? What my friend wanted to do was tell 4 or 5 of her close friends, and then they would tell the next circle out. And slowly the information would seep through the network, right? In partial ways, and not instantaneously. That's how it used to work. So the big question I think we're facing around privacy now is that we're not moving from one engineered system to another engineered system that has different characteristics. We're moving from an evolved system to an engineered system. We've pushed formal and explicit statements about privacy into our lives for the first time, right? Prior to the current era, the principal guarantor of privacy wasn't law or regulation, and it wasn't hardware or software. It was inconvenience, right? It was a hassle to spy on people, right? We lived most of our lives not in the bubble of privacy or the glare of publicness. We had what we called back in the day our personal life, right? That's a phrase almost no one uses anymore except to refer to technology. We have a lot of personal technology. We don't have so much personal life anymore. And in personal life, you can walk down the street with your friend having a conversation, and someone could be listening to you, but they're not. Right? And it's not like every word you say is being recorded for posterity. And now it is like that. It's a lot like that. And for people like my friend, it's almost completely like that, whose social life is lived hammer and tongs in these kinds of environments. And so the inefficiency of information flow wasn't a bug, it was a feature. Right? That's what privacy was. The guarantor of privacy was that it was simply difficult to say things in public. Right? And as long as we have a world of completely explicit privacy preferences, it isn't going to be a good fit for the way we live our lives. Right? This is a question of filtering, not a question of managing information at the source. It's really a question of how do we want to design the filters so that privacy works the way we need it to work. That's a story of outbound information flow. Spam is a story about inbound information flow. And those are both relatively clear cases. There are some stories where the information flow is so bound up in the institutional design that you can't even identify which direction the flow that needs to be filtered is going. I'll tell you another story that I think illustrates this problem. This is Chris Avenir. Was an 18-year-old. Because he's 18, right, he's grown up in this environment. By the time he was 5, the internet was public. By the time he was 10, the public web was well on the way to being built out. By the time he was 15, MySpace, Friendster, Facebook had all launched. And before he was 20, he goes to college. And this spring, up at Ryerson College in Canada, where he's a student, he enrolls in the chemistry class. And like students since time immemorial, he says, well, this is hard, and I'm going to work for the test, and so I'll start a study group. But because he's 18, he starts the study group on Facebook. He calls it the Dungeon / the Ryerson College Chemistry Study Group. And it goes pretty well. Right? He gets 146 of his classmates to join his study group. They're all sitting there talking about chemistry, and suddenly he's called up on charges. Right? And they threaten to expel him. How many charges? 147 charges, one for setting up a Facebook group and one for each of his fellow students who joined. Right? Ryerson College says this is cheating, straight up. Here's their point of view. Right? Their statement says, Facebook is media. We're treating this as publishing, and once you're operating in a mediated environment, it's immaterial to us how this works. Right? Here's Avenir's reaction. Right? He wasn't hiding anything. He did this on Facebook. He named the study group The Dungeon because that's the name of the room on the Ryerson campus where the real study groups meet. Right? So he thought, right, Facebook is just an extension of group life, and I'm just extending it into this other meeting. So what had Avenir done to freak Ryerson out so much? And what he'd done is he'd crashed two different kinds of information flow into one another. Right? Every college has two different messages, an inside message and an outside message. The inside message is, welcome to the community of scholars. We're glad you're here. Come join us. We're having a conversation. The best kind of class to be in is small seminars where you can discuss things with your peers. Right? It's very much about community, about conversation, about joining the group. And then to the outside world, they say, we do quality control of individual minds. Right? We pack them with education, and we've got enough education stuffed in, we slap a diploma on them and ship them to you. Right? And the thing that keeps these two modes from colliding is just that in the real world is a hassle, right? It's a hassle to get groups together. It's a hassle to coordinate times to meet. And so the real world stuff stays pretty much bounded by the walls of the campus, right? And so those two messages are just separated. And what Avenir did by moving this thing to Facebook is he caused those two messages to collide. And then we have the clash of metaphors, right? Ryerson College says Facebook is like media. Avenir says Facebook is just an extension of the real world. And we're caught in this kind of either-or choice, a little bit like the public or private choice around privacy. But the problem is that if you have to make that choice, you're going to make the wrong choice, right? You know what Facebook is like? It's not like a fax machine or a mimeograph, and it's not like a meeting in the basement of Ryerson College. Facebook turns out to be a lot like Facebook, right? That there is no metaphor that can be picked up and slapped onto it that will tell us what to do about it. Facebook is different than what's gone before. In fact, if it wasn't, it wouldn't get any users. Facebook is only worth spending time on because of that difference. And so there is no simple solution to this problem, right? Avenir obviously has a point. He's been invited into an environment where group conversation is the norm. He thought he was doing the right thing. But for all of Ryerson's terrible overreaction, they have a point too, right? Because even though there are study groups that meet in the real-world dungeon on the Ryerson campus, none of those tables seat 146, right? If you have a small study group, half a dozen people, and somebody comes in and says, you know what, I'm really just here to mooch off you guys. I just want to know the answers to the chemistry test, and I'm not going to participate, you get kicked out. right? Small groups defend themselves against free riders. Large groups don't, right? What the internet does, right, is allows large systems that are free rider tolerant rather than free rider resistant, right? There's 146 people in the Facebook group, right? Then somebody, right, somebody is free riding. And so it isn't about information, access to information. There's more information out there, right? We've known the formula for hydrochloric acid for some time now, right? We're not asking the students to figure it out because we need to know it. We're asking the students to figure it out because we need them to have experience figuring things out. Right? And this is, I think, exemplary of the filter failure issue. When you see the Ryerson College Chris Avenir fight, not as a fight over information or access to information, but rather a fight over flows and access to flows. Right? It suddenly becomes clear that what we're dealing with is not, oh, well, we can go back and put the filter at the source the way we've always done in the past. It really is about rethinking the institutional model. Right? You have to have group conversation. You have to have individual effort. You have to design a system that accommodates both, right? And we're breaking the system we've got. Part of the reason I think information overload presents itself as such a consistent problem is that we don't have the obvious tools to pick up in the current environment. Using a metaphor of media, using a metaphor of real space, each of those illuminates part of the current landscape, but not enough. We're really pitched forward into a kind of new challenge. Now, this isn't a design problem. I don't think anybody can go out and start coding up the college of the future tomorrow, right? This is more of a mental shift, right? It's a way of seeing the world that assumes that we are to information overload as fishes are to water. It's just what we swim in. Yitzhak Rabin, a man who would know, once said, if you have the same problem for a long time, maybe it's not a problem. Maybe it's a fact. Right? That's information overload. Talking about it, and especially talking about it as if it explains or excuses anything, is actually a distraction. Right? We've had information overload in some form or other since the 1500s. What's changing now is the filters we used for most of that 500-year period are breaking. And designing new filters doesn't mean simply updating the old filters. They've broken for structural reasons, not for sort of surface reasons. Right? Now, some of this is going to be, in some situations, this will be a simple matter of programming, as they say. Right? Certainly, the pressure to get this right has led to an enormous number of sort of post-categorical filtering mechanisms. It's why dig voting mechanisms work. It's why delicious tags work. It is the logic behind all search engines. But some of it is not. Some of it is actually going to be around rethinking social norms, right? When you feel yourself getting too much information, I think the discipline is not to say to yourself, what's happened to the information, but rather, what filter just broke? What was I relying on before that stopped functioning? Because when we start asking that question, we're going to get some clue as to where to put the design effort. Thank you very much.